Hello, and welcome to episode 85 of Prose. This week, we will be looking back at Darkness via two of the most downloaded stories in Prose's 2+ year history. The two stories presented this week appeared quite some time ago. The first coming to you all from Kyoto, Japan. The second from Mansfield College in Oxford, UK. A couple newish fans were wondering if I might throw some throwbacks out just for easier access for those that haven't quite been through the full catalog. So, Katrina, Yuri, Matilda, and Sven, consider yourselves heard. As I noted last week, and as you all can probably hear, the studio space here in Brooklyn is still a work in progress. So, maybe even as long as through episode 87, the sound quality will be variant. Still, we'll keep jaunting through fiction together, even if it means we have to have some on-the-go episodes where my equipment is mobile, my time is limited, and my studio an airport, a hotel lobby, or a random corner in which I enjoy the acoustics. I will do my best to provide you all some materials to enjoy with the best possible audio quality amid this transition. Anyway, thank you all for sticking with me, sending encouraging feedback, and for just being a great audience. The best way to help the podcast continue ever forward is to go and rate Prose on Apple Podcasts, and the easiest way to ensure you never miss an episode or any random announcement is to subscribe using the podcast catcher of your choice. Please do consider supporting the show through Patreon at patreon.com/prosepodcast. There, you can find loads of limited edition Prose swag that you can only obtain by becoming a patron of the show. Alright, let's get to the tale, shall we? This week, we have a re-release of Take a Break and Lovely, Dark, and Deep. Enjoy. Take a Break, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Keeping my options open might be one of the most disgusting phrases, concepts one can encounter in this life. The narcissism, using of people as stepping stones, and general cowardice that all make up this, yes, cowardly practice, is nauseating and borders on sociopathy.
Listen, Jeff, I just need to find myself. I have so much living to do, and, well, let's be honest. What we've been doing is boring. Let's just call it a break. We'll see what my next few international work trips bring, and in a year, maybe two, we'll go from there. We'll re-meet each other. You have to understand that I have to keep my options open. I need a clean break to live. Be alive.
What an odd thing to be echoing in Gina's mind as she lay in an ever-cooling barrage of water and an ever-growing pool of her own blood. That's what she had said to Jeff almost 3 months ago to the day. After 3 years together that were, and she did have to admit it, joyous, and by far the healthiest relationship she'd had with any man, she had been given a promotion at work. This promotion would actually see her making less money, but it would also see her traveling the world. She'd been jet-setting with the best and the brightest in the business world, and in style, making up for her drop in pay. Her main countries of influence in her new position with the firm were Australia, New Zealand, Greece, Italy, France, and Spain. She had drawn the two markets that everyone fought for. That's right, she, Jenna Infram, would basically be paid to vacation. Consultation on business ethics wasn't exactly demanding. Moreover, Her expertise in company benefits in regards to children and on-site children's services meant that she was often finished with her assignments and or use for various companies and their HR and legal departments in a tenth of the time her bosses seemed to think it might take her. Upon receiving the news then, she knew she simply couldn't allow herself not to take the opportunity for one last year to 2 years' worth of whirlwind living. Yes, she was well past her get blitzed and get fucked by some anonymous bull days. It was about time for her to fully embrace adulthood after all, but again, this was just too much to pass up. She thought of all the wild nights, all the photos to be envied by her friends and coworkers, all the shifting from a life that was too real. Her travels with the firm would mean there would be no insurance renewals, monthly bills to pay, house upkeep, office ins and outs, visits to her family, visits to his family, cleaning. All of this and more would disappear. The firm taking care of some of it, and some of it just ceasing to exist the moment she walked away from this burdensome life. Jeff, of course, had not taken the news well. Tears, blubbering, the whole shebang. She humored him with a warm ear but a cold shoulder. She couldn't have their mutual friends judging her for the why behind her decisions. This run with the firm would only be a year or two long, and she couldn't burn all her bridges. So, she put in minimal effort to give Jeff the time to lose his shit, and then she was off. Her first trip had been to New Zealand. It had been amazing. She had lived every cliche she could possibly squish into a month-long period of popping about the country. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, tourist traps, adventure touring. Gina did it all. Her second trip was to hop on over to Australia. It had also been wonderful. She had lived every cliche she possibly could squish into a 2-month-long period this time. Far greater qualities and quantities of sex, drugs, rock and roll, tourist traps, adventure touring. Gina continued to do it all. After her Oceania region consultations, she flew to LA for debriefs and a reset in the company's line toward customers. Apparently, Oceania's product concepts were much different than those of the Mediterranean and Europe. Gina had a week of learning what to say, what not to say, and how to say both before she was off on her second trip to Greece. Almost 4 months in, and she was feeling like a rock star. Jeff did not cross her mind once. Not ever. This first extended trip to Greece started rough, though. Gina should have known that this was an omen. Apparently, her company's contacts were not in Athens proper, so upon touching down in the ancient metropolis, she was quickly ushered into a less than glamorous, banged-up SUV that took her to nearby Akarnas. The suburb was full of 3-star hotels and was all but devoid of the nightlife that fed the appetites to which Gina had become accustomed to feeding. Still, she reminded herself again just how much better this all was than being shackled to an everyday, mundane adult life back in the US. At the end of the day of travel, all she wanted to do was wash the grime off of her and get some sleep before her presentations tomorrow. Once those were out of the way, there'd be far more time to head back into Athens and find some Greek men and ouzo to make this month start turning around really quickly. With those future forays into unshackled fun fresh in the front of her mind and fluttering on her lips, Gina started the shower, allowing it to heat up, and began to undress. She always loved to run the shower until the steam made the air thick and too warm for most. She tossed her traveling clothes on the floor, loving that there was no one there that she needed to worry about putting out or off by leaving such a mess, and she went to take her long-awaited shower.
Gina tested the water again with her hand, making sure that the water was just on the other edge of uncomfortably hot. Vivid visions of what Greece might hold in store were streaming through her mind as she stepped lightly into the tub. Tired or not, she might make this shower a little more interesting. Then, confusion. She'd stepped in with her left foot. She'd felt a real sinking feeling in her stomach. She'd heard a snap reminiscent of when she'd helped her father burn wood scraps from their yard, the sticks, twigs, and larger limbs cracking under the assault of the fire. She was lying down. She used to lie down in the shower when she was younger. She thought it was soothing, almost hypnotic. But then she did not do so in lukewarm water, and there was never blood around. What was going on? When she tried to sit up, pain rolled over her. She blinked heavy-lidded, taking an unmoving assessment. Gina realized she saw bone protruding from her right thigh. Blood was gushing from the hole where it was peeking out beyond her skin. The knee and thigh were at an angle that even her befuddled mind knew meant danger, meant pain. With the slightest tilt of her head left, she saw bone coming from her left arm, too. She must have fallen. She must have passed out. How long had she been down for? This was a lot of blood, and the water was far cooler than when she'd entered. She tried to get up once more before pain knocked her back into a prone position, threatening to make her black out. Gina called out for help. Her voice sounded weak, even to her. Over the shower, she doubted that anyone could hear her. She was getting extremely tired. She knew this was bad. If she went to sleep, she had no illusions that this meant she would die. The water would continue to cool. She would continue to bleed. The driver would report her as a no-show and go about his day in the morning. No one would think twice about it, her having ditched or rescheduled meetings to accommodate her new lifestyle before. It could be as long as 2, maybe 3 days before anyone might find her. Gina tried to pick herself up again. This time she pushed a foot or 2 off the tub before slipping again, falling backward and hitting the back of her head. Fireworks launched into her vision. She didn't black out, though. Still, Gina knew she was in real trouble. Her mind started to dance through everything that someone confronting their mortality generally thinks about. Family, childhood, past, fading future, mistakes, triumphs, religion. Unsummoned, Jeff came back to her for the first time in months. Jeff represented all of those things. He loved her family. He wanted her to be his family. He wanted to start a family. He had shared his childhood with her and showed genuine interest in hers. He had made her feel like a queen when they'd met. He had wanted to marry her. He had come to neglect her feelings. He had pushed her to be a better woman, always supporting her in all her efforts, even when the neglect came on, save this last one, of course. He had grown up in the church, which gave him a charm and calmness that she'd not seen in other men and other friends. Jeff, uninvited, was there with her, comforting her as she began to drift closer and closer to unconsciousness. He was always there for her until she'd pushed him away. And even now, he was back. Their life together played before her eyes. Their life as it could have been played before her eyes. While her words to him, as she let him know she was discarding him, began to ping around as an accompaniment.
Listen, Jeff, I just need to find myself.
I have so much living to do, and, well, let's be honest. What we've been doing is boring. Let's just call it a break. We'll see what my next few international work trips bring, and in a year, maybe 2, we'll go from there. We'll re-meet each other. You have to understand that I have to keep my options open. I need a clean break to live. Be alive. We'll re-meet each other. You have to understand that I have to keep my options open. Be alive. I need a clean break to live. Be alive.
Gina began to snicker, giggle, cackle. Her clean break had turned messy. Thank you for listening to Take a Break, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. All sounds that you hear present come from freesound.org and are being used under public domain licenses. What a fun little re-exploration, am I right? Please do stick around for our next story, a look back at Lovely, Dark, and Deep, the single most downloaded story in Prose's 2-year history.
Surprise! There is a full story this week, despite my saying otherwise during the introduction and the other 2 mini offerings. The sound quality you'll hear for this story will be a bit off, as I'm using a mobile sound studio from my little dorm room at Mansfield College and Oxford University. As for what will come next for the podcast, I mentioned the possibility of a change to Season 2, as Season 1 is drawing to a close. That being said, that update will come with next week's offerings. So, for now, sit back, relax, and do try to find some enjoyment in this rather dark story of love of nature and loss of love. Lovely, Dark, and Deep, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Fantasies almost always had their way with Stephen. At 4, he thought himself a brontosaurus and would stomp around the backyards and playgrounds and other lush, wooded areas of Benson, Arkansas. At 6, he shifted to being an otter. Sea or river, he did not care. He would slip down slides in otter-like ways and seek out water any chance he'd get. By 14, he had come at least slightly more into the realm of the realistic, pushing his focus toward being a rock star. If he could become a rock star, you see, he could embrace the magnifying glasses he wore over his eyes and his potbelly and his being different. It would all be part of the allure of being an oddity, as rock stars always are. That particular fantasy had never left Stephen. Others came and went with moods, friends, moves, and so on and so forth, but the desired rock stardom remained. Though, by the time he hit 35, he was finally fully aware that dinosaur and latrine and musician and the infinite other number of transformations he'd counted on saving him from his reality were, in the end, simple fantasies of an overactive imagination. Over the course of the past decade, Stephen had found a small degree of solace in the woods around his home. He'd long since moved from his Arkansan family, friends, and lands, opting into a nice little full-time professorship in southern New Hampshire instead. The change had not been all that jarring. The 2 places were far more alike than they were different. Still, the isolation coupled with the sputtering and dying delusion of becoming something grander took him to some extremely dark places. The woods, though. Man, oh man. He'd always enjoyed Robert Frost's poetry, and Thoreau's writings. But he'd also thought them a bit too based in some strange otherworldly something to fully believe. Transcendentalism and finding oneself in the woods of New England always seemed a bit far-fetched. Now that he had the ability to go strolling those wooded depths, Stephen was a far more respectful fan of those guys and gals. He would find himself immersed out in those connecting acres, disconnecting from the realities that had become all too real since those unencumbered days of childhood. That is not to say that he had no worries when he was out in the forests abutting his university-provided cottage. His imagination was still potent, despite the years of beating his fantastical dreams of future aggrandized worth out of him. The difference now was that his imagination drove him into far darker places of the recesses of his mind and the realm of possibilities. A bump in the night became a vengeful spirit come to take him away. A scratching at the rotting wood of his walls was some Osherian plot given life, and the scratching then the last desperate attempts at escape by some walled-in woman. And these imaginings go on into infinity. Really, there was no limit to the ghouls and beasties that came to visit him in his imagination. Those nighttime imaginings, be they in the woods or in his home, were not the worst of it, though. He was a full hour from any town and a good 30 minutes' walk to the university's Sylvan campus. Yes, the surroundings were gorgeous. No, the isolation was not equally gorgeous, at least not to Stephen. At first, the peace that it brought him was something he felt blessed by. The fast-paced pushing and shouting of the city were unthinkable out here. The obligation of having to wave, smile, and inevitably make small talk with a neighbor was not present here either. This freedom from social obligation, or in the case of the city, imprisonment, was welcomed and made Stephen giddy with the possibilities. He could piss outside when drunk. He could get a dog and let it have far more freedom than any one pup could hope for. He could lie out naked on a blanket in the warm months, tanning his skin, which was turning pallid with study and the complacency that old age and too much work bring. He could be himself, never being judged for whichever skin he chose to throw on for the course of the day. The problem with this Eden-esque expectation is that, like all things, perfection is always imperfect. Everything always has its flaws, no matter how minute. In the case of his adopted home environs, it was that once loved, now hated isolation from the rest of humanity. The dull buzz of mindless television, the inspirational turned invigorating turned heart-rending tunes of his chosen music of the moment, the newfound habit he'd acquired of really, truly talking to himself in lieu of genuine, existent conversation. All of it lost its luster rather quickly, the novelty negated within a mere 3 months of his moving in. With this diminishing of potency of these coping methods, his tolerance for silence contracted, making the situation doubly worse, as he could not stand having the dead chatter, while not having it threatened to drive him mad. In the beginning of this loathing of silence, he did make an effort to reach out to others. He tried to invite others over for bonfires and beers, but the droning of senseless talk from his colleagues was almost worse than the seclusion. That college professors could be so plain staggered his connection with the world even further, making him feel all the more isolated. He had tried his hand at dating a young woman, Janine, as well. In fact, he'd loved her with every molecule of his being. He'd told her as much, something quite unlike him despite his adoration of poetry and music and his love of, well, love. They had bought a little rescue dog from the local shelter, naming the little guy Janvers, some silly name that sprung up in their excitement as they drove him home from the animal shelter. and their little trio became inseparable, often strolling through the nearer wooded areas, letting the little pup stretch his legs. Janine had kept him company for about 2.5 years of the 4 he'd been living in the house, but she was far less attached to him than he her. So, she inevitably withdrew, began looking beyond their personal arcady they shared for a time, decided the outside world outweighed whatever they were doing, and left right around year 4 of his tenure in the Timbers. That rejection of everything that he was destroyed his confidence, and he would never quite recover from Janine's very clear message of his worth or lack thereof. She took the dog with her, adding additional hurt where Stephen thought there could be no more. Thus ended his attempts at finding friendship and companionship in the depths of the New Hampshire forests. It was the isolation, then, that drove him further into the forest. Fears that he always knew were irrational became even more so because of his desperation for newness and something else. He would be rather adventurous, striking out in different directions from his house, leaving the paths that were well-trodden to create his own, taking his own paths and purposefully going left when the only way he knew back to the house required a right. Time and time and time again, he allowed himself to go out and get lost in the vastness that surrounded him on all sides. This practice brought some small joys, to be sure. He often came upon deer, turkeys, beavers, porcupines, and once even a small bear. Battalions of chipmunks would chirp at him when he trundled through their territory. He would find brooks whispering through the tall grass, begging a passerby to come sit by them and reflect, both a blessing and a curse for Stephen. He would be humbled time and again by the impossibly enormous oaks and other trees that must have been in the area when the nation was not even a forethought in the nations of Europe's minds, and the native peoples lived out their lives amid the grand spectacles of nature. Touching the behemoths brought him momentary armistice with his own hostile mind and his ever-churning restless spirit. This being the beginning of year 5, he'd only been walking in the woods in this fashion for about 4 months, Janine having left somewhere there in year 4. Despite that limited time, he'd now become quite familiar with his environs. New paths were trodden. Animals began to stop fleeing from him, knowing he was a familiar wanderer that would not harm them, just a small disturbance in their daily routines. To be honest, he became part of their daily routines. In the middle of his 5th October, still the knife's point of his 5th year there, is when he made his ultimate discovery. As the chill began to sneak into the New England air, he came upon a clearing in one of the thickets he'd been walking in. The solid canopy gave way to short grass and but a few scattered trees. The difference was stark, and the suddenness with which Stephen came into this secret grotto was something startling. The chief feature were actually 3 of those sparse trees that were in the middle of the clearing. 3 gargantuan oaks of the sort he so admired stood sentinel, knotted and steadfast. He immediately made his way to the largest of the 3, giving it a once-over, circumnavigating the wide base and grinning like a fool at the quilt of moss and short grasses that blanketed the area directly beneath the extensive boughs. It felt natural, almost expected, to lie down on that soft undergrowth, devoid of stickers and nettles and other nasties that might make such an experience unpleasant in other parts of the forest. His first thought was how much Janine and Janvers would love this place. Her for the picture postcard beauty, and him for the open area for frolicking and cool padded place to lie down. Those flashes always came unbidden, and they always made him curl back in pain, like a child who accidentally touches a hot pan after already having made this mistake before in its young life. The recoil being all the more jarring, and the pain being all the more searing, knowing what it entails. No, more like a grown man that saw his greatness flicker and his last chances at the life he wanted walk out to move on to more electric possibilities. He was lesser than a cliched set of hypothetical possibilities. Yeah, humbling. The glade lulled him to sleep in spite of the attacks from the desolate mood taking him over. Maybe this is what ultimately drew him there time and time again. It's not that he found a measure of peace or happiness there. Quite the opposite, in fact, in some ways. More that, for whatever reason, he couldn't keep his eyes open. He'd bring an audiobook to listen to on his phone, asleep in 5 minutes. He'd bring a physical copy of a text he'd very much been looking forward to, asleep in 3. He'd take a jug of coffee and some papers to grade. The caffeine would fail him 10 to 15 minutes in, and sleep would inevitably drag him down. The waking world stood no chance in this place. He began thinking of these forays to the glade as little deaths, times when he would leave his corporeal self for something more ethereal. He couldn't help but think of all the fairy stories, myths, legends, poems, and songs of the Sidhe and the mystical realms of innumerable people's folk beliefs. He couldn't avoid the loads of literature he had read that referenced sleep as a liminal place, a place that touched on the edges of death and, as his favorite prince had put it, the undiscovered country from which no one can return. As a younger man, these thoughts would have scared him. In fact, for a large portion of his life, sleep did terrify him. He'd wanted to see death coming when it came, not have it sneak up and take him away from his family and friends while he was off his guard. The calm and restfulness this sleep brought were not something he feared, but something he sought. Stephen found himself thinking about the little clearing and its 3 oaks more and more during his waking hours. He would be scrawling something on the whiteboard for his students to hurriedly scribble down, and he would find that he'd stopped, the student's discomfort palpable as he stood unmoving, staring intently at the blank board, his mind off in that place. Department meetings found him doodling the general of the oaks of the glade on napkins. Even during conversations, he could not help but let his mind wander back there, despite his active attempts at staying in the moment with his colleagues, students, or acquaintances. To his credit, no one seemed to notice. Then again, no one ever did. That was his life now. October passed with him going back to the glade every single day. November did too. He actually spent Thanksgiving out on the spot, his family having elected not to celebrate together because of many unforeseen complications. December in New England brings snows like he'd never seen in Arkansas, and he normally avoided the cold and the snow at all costs. This winter, the draw of the glade was too great. He trudged out even in the worst of conditions. Bundled up, he would still find himself frozen to the core after being out for even half an hour, yet he would remain among his arboreal friends for long past the hour mark. He would only rouse himself to leave when he felt sleep beginning to come. The rigid conditions kept him more awake and alert than usual, but the incitement only lasted for a time. The cold had always sung lullabies to men and women, pushing them into the warmth of the unconscious world. But that's where true death would await. All those Scandinavian folk tales of frost giants soothing you to sleep with song and whispers existed for a good reason. Stephen knew this, And, for the first time, he began to force himself to leave whenever the call to sleep came. Like his family Thanksgiving, his Christmas was canceled. This time, the weather made flying or driving home impossible. It was the disruption of 34 going on 35 years of family tradition that shook him once more. As silly as it sounded even to him, Stephen felt like he should dress up for his Christmastime excursion to the clearing. He could not avoid going at this special time of year. If he couldn't be around his family, he would go out to the magical spot, and he wanted to do something special. Barring borrowing a car from someone at the school to attend a church service, this was his best bet. He chose Christmas Eve for his visit. Stephen put on his favorite slacks, shirt, tie, and blazer, and made his way out to the glade. As usual, the stinging air kept him lucid for at least an hour. After that, his eyes began to droop. This time, he gave in to sleep's call. When he woke, his skin was aflame. His lungs throbbed and he couldn't feel his hands or feet. Cursing himself, he got to shaking what little snow had fallen through the largest oak's branches off of himself, jump-starting his circulation and raising his heartbeat with the action. That was dangerous. That was downright stupid. That was paradise. The draw of this place was undeniable to him, and he knew it had to go beyond just being some hidden special spot that looked neat. While he made his way home, he made a decision, though. This glade had given him the only true taste of belonging and companionship that he'd had in years. Janine having proven hers was counterfeit. He wasn't getting any younger, and all those dreams of becoming a dinosaur, otter, rock star, person of note, they were all long gone and growing more distant with each passing day. He still had a measure of respect from his colleagues and love from his family, though that was diminishing at an alarming rate too. The half-life of one's importance to others is startlingly short. He couldn't go out on top or be some legend at this point, but he could choose to transition into something more akin to fable, a fleeting memory that elicited an, "Oh, that's too bad," or an, "Oh yeah, I think I remember him." That's better than he had now, he thought, as he kicked off his shoes before entering his house there at the end of his walk home. It might have been being out in the glade in his dress clothes that finally pushed him into his final decision. He kept imagining how otherworldly he must have looked. Only barely dusted in snow and in a suit and tie out in the glade. His mind painted a beautiful picture, akin to Snow White, shaping him into something of a forest deity there among the oaks of the clearing. Stephen rented the nicest suit he'd ever worn on December 30th. It was a deep gray Armani. He'd actually reserved it on the 26th. He'd have done so on Christmas, but the rental place was closed. He borrowed a school vehicle to pick his rental up, lying and saying he had to get his computer repaired at the Staples that happened to be next door. At the rental place, he purchased a fancy goldenrod-colored tie and a lighter gray shirt. The attendants swore this was the sharpest a man could look. He kept the suit hanging in the living room, so he could see it while he typed warm emails to family and his long-neglected friends from a lifetime ago, reveling in all the cheer the holidays are supposed to bring. New Year's Eve day was spent tidying his house, whistling along lightheartedly to top 40 tunes that were serving as the vehicle for reminiscence for all those soon-to-be revelers. Since it got dark around 4:00 p.m. this far north, he ceased his cleaning around 1 p.m. He then took a shower and groomed himself impeccably, saving the donning of the suit until he looked just right. By 3:30, the sun had begun its crawl toward the western horizon. He set out then, as the shadows began to lengthen. The light was gray wisps and nothing more when he arrived in the glade. He laid a thick blanket down on the snow beneath the largest oak. He then lied down himself and began conversing. With whom? The easy answer was himself. But maybe the trees? Maybe God? Maybe Janine and Janvers, hoping they'd somehow feel it through the world spirit or some lingering connection. After only 20 minutes of chatting into the silent, snow-filled near darkness, full night had come, and so had the sweet song of the cold, harmoniously asking him to drift away into sleep. Rather than fight, or move or leave, Stephen greeted the cold and thanked it for helping him transition to the waiting room that is sleep, knowing that tonight he'd go beyond that waiting room for the first and only time. He thought of this place as magical, and there was a feeling that allowing himself this comfort of drifting away from this rough and tumble world, here and tonight, might afford him some sort of special pass to an even more special place. Maybe he would join the kingdom of the fairies. Magic was magic, after all. His final thoughts, as he felt himself move toward the velvety blackness, the starless night, were that this did not feel scary or wrong or like an end. Were full of frolicking otters and chuffing brontosauruses and cheering crowds chanting his name. Or of how pristine he would look weeks from now when he was found encased in snow and ice. Were of a girl he'd loved, a little dog, and his family, now lost. Were of poetry. He recited a bit of Robert Frost, almost inaudibly, his jaw trembling in the frigidity, mumbling it as a thank you to the glade, a final good night as he moved on to his next journey. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. Thus I must lie down in them and sleep. I will lie down in them to sleep.
Thank you for listening to Lovely, Dark, and Deep. The music you have heard here comes from the Free Music Archive. The beginning and end of the story is Worlds Fall Apart, instrumental version by Josh Woodward from his album Addressed to the Stars. It is being used under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 international license. The tune for the vast middle of the story is 5-Minute Meditations, album mix with Alpha Waves by Lee Rosevere, coming from his album 5-Minute Meditations. It is being used under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial 4.0 international license. My apologies again for the quality of the recording. As I explained, this little exercise in mobile audio production has been illuminating, but I fear it resulted in a less than quality recording for all of you. Still, I do hope that you enjoyed the story. If you did, and might like a better production of it, do let me know. I'll re-record it upon getting back to my little home studio. That does it for prose this week, for real this time. I pray I get to be with all of you again next week for more stories. I hope you've enjoyed this look back, and I look forward to joining you again in 2 weeks' time. Until then, love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is always stranger than fiction. Goodbye.